Twice in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, America held a presidential election, and the person who got the most votes lost. In 2016, Hillary Clinton received nearly 3 million more votes than Donald Trump. In 2000, Al Gore received over 500,000 more votes than George W. Bush. Yet in both cases, the loser was declared the winner. This isn't a recount error, it's not a bug in the system, it is the system, working exactly as designed. It's called the Electoral College. The mechanism is deceptively simple. When you vote for president, you're not actually voting for a candidate. You're voting for a slate of party loyalists called electors, and they are the ones who officially choose the president. Because this system allocates electors on a state-by-state, winner-take-all basis, a candidate can lose the national popular vote but still win the presidency by piecing together narrow victories in the right combination of states. This is why a voter in Wyoming has nearly 4 times the impact on the outcome as a voter in California. So why is it like this? How did the world's oldest continuous democracy create a system where more votes can mean less power? To understand the glitch, you have to understand that it was never a glitch at all. The conventional answer you hear is that the Electoral College was a compromise to protect small states from the tyranny of large ones. But that's only part of the story, and it's not the most consequential part. The truth is, the system that denies the popular will today was created to protect the political power of a different group entirely: slave owners. This is the story of how the 1787 decision to allocate presidential electors based on congressional representation laundered the pro-slavery 3/5 compromise into the presidential selection process. It was a last-minute, almost accidental invention, born of deadlock and desperation. But this decision permanently embedded a state-based, anti-majoritarian bias into the American system of government, a ghost in the machine that still picks the president today. Philadelphia, summer 1787. In a stuffy room with the windows nailed shut to prevent eavesdropping, the framers of the Constitution were deadlocked. They had agreed on a Congress and a Supreme Court. But the executive, the president, was a problem they couldn't solve. How do you create a leader, powerful enough to run a country, but not so powerful they become a king? The most fundamental question was the most divisive: who should choose them? On one side were the populists, led by the brilliant Pennsylvania lawyer James Wilson. Wilson's argument was direct and, to modern ears, obvious: let the people vote. He argued for a national popular vote, believing that the only legitimate government was one that drew its authority directly from the legitimate source of all authority, the people. But men like Gouverneur Morris, also of Pennsylvania, were deeply skeptical. They feared the public was too ill-informed, too susceptible to a charismatic demagogue. Morris warned that a popular vote would lead to what he called the tyranny of the majority. For them, a safer option was to let Congress pick the president. This created an impossible choice. If the people chose, they could be duped by a charlatan. But if Congress chose, the president would be a pawn of the legislature, forever trading favors and vulnerable to corruption. As one delegate put it, it would be the work of intrigue, of cabal, and of faction. Because neither side trusted the other's solution, the debate went nowhere for months. This stalemate, born of a deep fear of both concentrated power and popular passion, forced the delegates to look for another way. It was this exhaustion that opened the door for a last-minute compromise. A complex, indirect system that nobody truly loved, but that solved an immediate political crisis by creating a permanent structural problem. This is why James Wilson's proposal was so explosive. He wasn't just suggesting a new method, he was challenging the entire foundation of power in his era. For Wilson, the logic was inescapable. If the United States was to be a nation of people, not a league of states, then the people themselves must be the ultimate source of authority. His plan for a national popular vote was the purest expression of that idea. What did this mean in practice? It meant that a farmer in rural Georgia would have the same say in choosing the president as a wealthy merchant in Philadelphia. It meant state borders, for the purpose of this one election, would become irrelevant. There would be one electorate, one national tally, and one winner. Wilson argued this was the only way to create a truly independent executive, a president who owed his allegiance not to Congress, not to state legislatures, but to the American people as a whole. This was a strategically radical vision. It aimed to forge a direct, personal link between the president and the citizenry, creating a powerful new center of gravity in the political system. By making the president the people's choice, Wilson believed he could create a leader strong enough to stand against the factions in Congress and the parochial interests of the states. It was a clean, democratic solution to the problem of a king. But in that room, full of men who represented state interests, this beautiful idea was also deeply threatening. Wilson's vision of popular power ran headfirst into a wall of fear. For every delegate who saw the people as the source of legitimacy, there was another who saw them as a source of chaos. Men like Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry, and Pennsylvania's own Gouverneur Morris led the charge against a popular vote, and their arguments are the very same ones used to defend the Electoral College today. Their first objection was a calculated appeal to elite anxiety. The general public, they argued, was simply too ill-informed and too scattered across a vast continent to make a wise choice. Gerry put it bluntly, stating the people would be misled by a few designing men. Morris worried about a charismatic demagogue sweeping the nation. For them, a direct democracy was a fire to be contained, not a principle to be celebrated. They wanted a republic, a system of filters and representatives designed to cool popular passions, not transmit them directly into power. Because of this fear, they also made a strategic argument about geography and power. A national popular vote, they warned, would mean that presidential candidates would only campaign in the most populous states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and ignore the smaller ones completely. Why would a candidate bother with Delaware or Rhode Island when they could win the entire election in a few major cities? These were the public philosophical objections, and they were powerful. But beneath this debate over the wisdom of the common voter was a deeper, unstated calculation about who, exactly, would be counted. These were the public philosophical objections. And they were powerful. But beneath this debate over the wisdom of the common voter was a deeper, unstated calculation about who, exactly, would be counted as the people. This calculation is the hidden engine of the entire conflict, and at its center was Virginia's James Madison. Madison, the intellectual architect of the convention, was also a pragmatist and a slaveholder. He understood the brutal political math that made a direct popular vote impossible. The source of this problem was a deal that had already been struck, the 3/5 compromise. To determine a state's representation in Congress, the delegates had agreed to count every free person plus 3/5 of all other persons, a sanitized euphemism for enslaved African Americans. This was a purely strategic move for power. It gave the southern states more seats in the House of Representatives, and thus more influence over federal law, based on a population they enslaved and denied all rights. Because of this, Madison knew a national popular vote for president was a non-starter. In a direct election, only actual voters would count. The South's political power, artificially inflated in Congress by the 3/5 compromise, would simply vanish. The northern states, with their larger voting populations, would dominate every single election. Madison laid out the calculus in his own notes with stark clarity. The right of suffrage was much more diffusive in the northern than the southern states, he wrote. He concluded that the southern states could have no influence in the election on the score of the Negroes. This was the unspoken, non-negotiable demand from the South. Any system for choosing the president had to preserve the power they had already secured through the 3/5 compromise. It wasn't just about fearing the mob or protecting small states. It was about ensuring that their power, built on the backs of the enslaved, would be baked into the executive branch itself. The beautiful, simple idea of one person, one vote was dead on arrival. The convention was deadlocked. For months, the delegates had been trapped in a circular argument. A direct popular vote was unacceptable to the South and to the elites who feared democracy. But letting Congress pick the president, the most popular alternative, risked turning the executive into a puppet of the legislature. With the convention teetering on the edge of failure, the entire problem was handed off to a special committee, the Committee of 11, to invent a solution. This is where the political sausage got made. The committee, which included James Madison, didn't invent a new philosophy. Instead, they stitched together a pragmatic and deeply consequential machine. The result was the Electoral College. Here's how their calculated compromise worked. Each state would be given a number of presidential electors. How many? The answer was a stroke of strategic genius. A state's electoral votes would equal its number of representatives in the House, plus its 2 senators. This simple formula was the key that unlocked the entire puzzle. Because the number of House seats was already times determined by the 3/5 compromise, This new system effectively laundered the South's slavery-based power directly into the presidential elections. This last-minute compromise was designed to satisfy everyone's core demand. The anti-Democrats got their wish for a filter between the people and the president. The small states got a slight boost from the 2 bonus votes for their senators. And most importantly, the southern slave states got the grand prize, a system where their non-voting, enslaved population still translated directly into power in picking the president. It was a political fix, not a philosophical ideal. A compromise designed to hold a fragile union together by embedding its original sin into the very heart of the new government. This is how the ghost got into the machine. On the surface, the Committee of 11's formula, electors equal to a state's House members, plus its 2 senators, seemed like an elegant, neutral piece of math, but it was a Trojan horse. Hidden inside was the 3/5 compromise, a ghost that would haunt every presidential election to come. Here's how the calculated mechanism worked. Consider 2 states from that era, Pennsylvania and Virginia. They had roughly the same number of free citizens, but Virginia also had hundreds of thousands of enslaved people. Pennsylvania had none when it came to counting population for House seats. Virginia was allowed to count 3/5 of its enslaved population. This gave Virginia more representatives in Congress than Pennsylvania, even though it had fewer voters. This is the critical link. Because the number of presidential electors was tied directly to congressional representation, Virginia's slave bonus in the House automatically became a slave bonus in the Electoral College. Those extra representatives, granted on behalf of people who could not vote, translated into extra electors who could pick the president. The delegates who owned slaves, men like Madison, understood this math perfectly. It wasn't a bug. It was the feature. They had successfully created a system where political power could be derived from owning human beings. This formula ensured that the presidency itself would be weighted toward the South, embedding a permanent, pro-slavery, anti-majoritarian bias into the highest office in the land. This electoral advantage was not theoretical. It had immediate, nation-shaping consequences. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry before the system began producing its intended results, creating a political powerhouse that would dominate the new nation for a generation. This is why, for 32 of the first 36 years of the United States, the president was a slave-owning Virginian. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a direct outcome of the electoral math. Thomas Jefferson's narrow victory in 1800, for example, would have been impossible without the electoral votes generated by the enslaved population of the South. He won the presidency because of the very people he held in bondage. This era became known as the Virginia Dynasty. This dominance, powered by the ghost in the formula, allowed the South to protect its primary economic and political interest: the institution of slavery. With a friendly executive in power, Southern leaders could block any federal attempt at abolition, control judicial appointments, and steer national policy in their favor. The system James Madison had so carefully helped engineer was the very system that propelled him and his political allies to the nation's highest office. And so, the presidency became the first line of defense for slavery, a political firewall built with the electoral votes of the very people it enslaved. And so, the presidency became the first line of defense for slavery, a political firewall built with the electoral votes of the very people it enslaved. That system, the Virginia Dynasty, feels like ancient history. But its ghost is still with us. This is why, twice in the 21st century, we have watched a presidential candidate win the most votes from the American people and still lose the election. The glitch that put Thomas Jefferson in power is the same glitch that determined the outcomes in 2000 and 2016. The names and parties have changed, but the math has not. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and the 14th Amendment theoretically ended the 3/5 compromise. It seemed the original sin of the Constitution had finally been cleansed from the presidential election system. But here's the twist. It wasn't. Because while the delegates in 1787 had created the 3/5 rule to empower slave states, they laundered that power through a different, more durable mechanism: the total number of congressional representatives. The formula for electors was a state's number of House members, plus its 2 senators. This is the compromise that never died. The +2 senators part of the formula is the ghost in our modern machine. It was the back door through which the founders baked a permanent, anti-majoritarian bias into the system. Just as the 3/5 clause gave disproportionate power to states with large, non-voting enslaved populations, the +2 senators formula now gives disproportionate power to states with small voting populations. Wyoming, with 500,000 people, gets 3 electoral votes. California, with nearly 40 million, gets 54. Do the math. Each Wyoming voter has nearly 4 times the say in a presidential election as a California voter. This is the direct legacy of James Madison's calculus. The modern argument that the Electoral College protects small states is a sanitized echo of the original argument to protect slave states. The justification has changed, but the structural imbalance remains. The system is still working as it was designed, to dilute the power of a popular majority and grant outsized influence to a specific set of states. The popular vote loser who wins the presidency isn't an anomaly. It is the quiet, logical, and deeply consequential outcome of a 230-year-old compromise made to protect the institution of slavery. If you found this eye-opening, hit subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden history that shapes our world today, and leave a comment. Before watching this, were you taught that the Electoral College was about protecting slavery or about protecting small states?